I never believed in the stories my grandfather told around the fire when I was a child, the ones whispered in our language that made the other elders lean in close and nod with knowing eyes. I thought they were just tales meant to keep us respectful of the forest, the kind of folklore every family passes down until it loses all meaning and becomes nothing more than tradition. But when I received the call that he had died alone in his cabin, deep in the forests of northern Michigan, something shifted inside me, a feeling I couldn't name, like the ground beneath my feet had suddenly become uncertain. I made the drive north through endless corridors of pine and birch, the trees growing denser with each mile, until civilization felt like a memory I might have imagined. The cabin appeared exactly as I remembered it from childhood visits, a weathered structure that seemed to have grown from the forest itself, surrounded by shadows that moved differently than they should. Everything was as he'd left it, the coffee mug still on the table, his boots by the door, the smell of wood smoke and tobacco lingering in the air like he might walk back in at any moment. But as I approached the entrance, my hand reaching for the door, I saw them. Deep claw marks gouged into the wooden frame, for parallel lines that had torn through the old timber with such force that splinters still hung loose in the wounds. They weren't there the last time I visited, 6 months ago, and they were fresh enough that I could smell the raw wood exposed beneath. I stood there for longer than I should have, my fingers hovering over those marks without quite daring to touch them, feeling the hair on the back of my neck rise in a way that awakened something primal and forgotten. The scratches were too high to have been made by any animal I knew, reaching well above my head, and too deliberate in their spacing to be accidental. Whatever had made them had been tall, powerful, and standing on its hind legs when it dragged its claws down the frame. With unmistakable intention, the forest around me had gone silent in that particular way that makes you aware of being watched, the birds quiet, the wind holding its breath, and I understood with sudden clarity that I was not supposed to be here. But I had nowhere else to go. The estate needed to be settled, his belongings sorted, legal matters attended to with the kind of bureaucratic finality that follows death. I pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the dimness of a life interrupted. The scratches followed me inside, not physically, but in my mind, where they continued to echo with a question I wasn't ready to ask: who or what had been trying so desperately to get in? The cabin felt smaller than I remembered, more confined, as if the walls had drawn closer in my grandfather's absence, or perhaps in response to something pressing in from outside. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon light that cut through the windows like spotlights, illuminating a stage where something significant was about to unfold. His possessions surrounded me, with the weight of a life fully lived in solitude, the kind of intentional aloneness that isn't loneliness, but rather a deliberate retreat from a world that had become too loud, too bright, too disconnected from older truths. I moved through the room slowly, touching the spines of his books, running my fingers over the carved wooden figures on the mantel, feeling like an archaeologist excavating not just a home, but a mystery I was only beginning to comprehend. On the writing desk near the window, I found a leather journal, thick and worn, the cover stained with use and marked with symbols I recognized from childhood, but couldn't quite translate. Something told me not to open it yet, to wait until darkness fell and I was truly alone with whatever secrets it contained. But my hands moved of their own accord, and as I lifted the cover, I saw the first sketch, a figure that was neither fully wolf nor fully man, rendered in obsessive detail with eyes that seemed to follow me across the page. That's when I heard it for the first time. Just as the sun was beginning to sink below the tree line, a sound that wasn't quite scratching and wasn't quite knocking, but something in between, methodical and patient. It came from somewhere outside, moving along the exterior wall with the deliberate pace of something that had all the time in the world and knew exactly what it was looking for. I stood frozen in the center of the cabin, the journal still open in my hands, and understood with the kind of certainty that bypasses logic entirely that whatever had marked the door had returned. It had been waiting for me to arrive, waiting for nightfall, waiting to resume something my grandfather's death had left unfinished. The scratching continued, moving from wall to wall, and I realized with growing dread that it was circling the cabin, testing every window, every door, every possible point of entry, learning, watching, and in that moment, standing in my dead grandfather's isolated cabin with darkness gathering outside and something impossible moving through the shadows, I finally understood that the old stories weren't folklore at all, they were warnings, and I had just inherited whatever terrible truth they'd been trying to tell. I waited until the scratching stopped, until the silence returned thick and suffocating like a presence of its own. Before I dared to move again, the journal lay open before me, its pages, yellowed and brittle, filled with my grandfather's handwriting, a script I recognized but rendered strange by the urgency with which it had been written. Letters pressed so hard into the paper that some pages bore the ghost impressions of words written long before. The sketches covered nearly every page, evolving from rough outlines to increasingly detailed renderings that showed the same figure from different angles, in different postures, always with those eyes that seemed to hold not animal cunning, but something closer to comprehension, to awareness, to a kind of knowledge that predated language itself. Some drawings showed it standing at the forest edge, others crouched near the cabin, and still others depicted it in profile against a full moon, head tilted as if listening to something only it could hear. Between the sketches, my grandfather had written notes in our native language, words I hadn't spoken since childhood and could barely piece together now, my assimilation into the modern world having cost me this vocabulary of older things. I could make out fragments, warnings about offerings, about respect, about boundaries that must be maintained between worlds that were never meant to touch, but somehow did in this forgotten corner of the North Woods. The word that appeared most frequently was one I vaguely remembered from those fireside stories, a term that translated roughly to the watcher or perhaps the guardian, though neither English word captured the weight of responsibility and dread the original carried. As I turned the pages, the sketches grew more detailed and more disturbing in their precision, suggesting that my grandfather hadn't been working from memory or imagination, but from direct observation, from hours spent studying this creature in the way a naturalist might document a rare species. Except there was nothing clinical in these drawings. There was reverence in every line, and fear, and something else I couldn't quite identify, a kind of sorrowful acceptance, as if he were recording not just an animal but a relationship, a connection that had defined his life in ways I was only beginning to understand. One page showed the creature's hands in close detail, the way the fingers were too long and jointed wrong for human anatomy, but clearly capable of manipulation, of grasping, of the kind of dexterity that implied tool use and intention. Another page depicted its eyes, from directly ahead, the pupils reflecting light in that distinctive eyeshine common to nocturnal predators, but the expression surrounding them was wrong for an animal to focused, to evaluative, to aware of being observed in return. My grandfather had written beneath this sketch a single phrase in English, as if he'd wanted to ensure there was no misunderstanding for whoever found this journal after his death. It reads simply, "It knows what I am thinking." The words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature, and I found myself glancing toward the windows, suddenly conscious of how visible I was in the lamplight, how exposed, how thoroughly on display for anything watching from the darkness beyond the glass. The most unsettling pages came near the middle of the journal, where the sketches showed the creature not in the forest, but near the cabin itself, standing at windows, approaching the door, positioned in places that made it clear it had been observing my grandfather inside his own home. Just as I was now reading about those observations, he had documented dates beside some entries, creating a timeline that stretched back decades, showing that this had not been occasional encounters, but a sustained presence, a relationship that had endured longer than most marriages, longer than most friendships, a connection maintained through seasons and years with the consistency of ritual. The notes accompanying these drawings spoke of offerings left at the forest edge: venison, tobacco, cornmeal, items traditional to our people's old practices that I had thought were purely ceremonial, metaphorical gestures toward respect for nature rather than literal gifts to something that actually came. To collect them, my grandfather had kept meticulous records of what he left and when, noting changes in the creature's behavior based on the offerings, describing how it would approach closer or keep its distance, how it would leave signs of acknowledgement or displeasure, how it responded to the phases of the moon and the turning of seasons. In one entry, written in shaking handwriting that suggested either great age or great distress, he had written that the pact must not be broken, that the offerings must continue, that our family had accepted this responsibility generations ago, and the consequences of abandonment were too terrible to name. The final sketches in the journal showed something I hadn't expected: evidence of others like it, smaller figures that might have been offspring or pack members, suggesting this wasn't a solitary aberration, but something with social structure, with family, with the kind of complexity that transformed it. From creature to culture, from animal to something that demanded an entirely different category of existence. My grandfather had drawn them gathering in a clearing deep in the woods, arranged in what looked almost like a council. And beneath this image he had written in our language, a word I did remember from childhood, one the elders had used with hushed voices when speaking of things that existed in the spaces between their Christian faith and older beliefs they couldn't quite abandon. The word meant something like the first people or the people who were here before people, and seeing it written in connection to these drawings reframed everything I thought I understood about folklore and mythology and the stories we tell to make sense of a world that refuses to be entirely known. I sat there in the growing darkness, the journal heavy in my hands, and realized that my grandfather hadn't been documenting legends or preserving cultural stories. He had been keeping a record of something real, something that had walked beside our family for longer than history remembered, and his death had left that ancient relationship in a state of dangerous uncertainty. Whatever was outside, circling the cabin and testing the boundaries, wasn't hunting me. It was waiting to see what I would do, whether I would honor what my grandfather had maintained or break a pact I hadn't known existed until this moment, and the weight of that choice settled over me like a physical thing, heavy and inescapable as the darkness gathering outside. I decided to stay awake that first night, though I told myself it was only to finish organizing my grandfather's papers, to make sense of the estate documents and legal forms that required my attention. But the truth was simpler and more primal than that. I was afraid to sleep, afraid to surrender consciousness while something unknown circled the perimeter of this isolated cabin where the nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away, and cell service existed only as a theoretical concept. I kept the fire burning, fed it log after log until the heat grew oppressive and sweat dampened my collar. But the warmth felt like protection somehow, like the flames were a barrier between the world I understood and whatever waited in the darkness. Beyond these walls, the scratching began just after midnight, a sound so deliberate and measured that it couldn't be mistaken for branches scraping against wood or the settling of old timber. It started at the front door, a methodical drag of something hard against the frame, moving from bottom to top in slow vertical strokes that suggested intentionality, that implied purpose rather than accident. I froze in my chair, the estate documents forgotten in my lap, every sense suddenly amplified as I strained to interpret what I was hearing. The scratching continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped with an abruptness that was somehow worse than the sound itself, leaving only the crack and pop of the fire and the thunder of my own pulse in my ears. The silence lasted just long enough for me to wonder if I had imagined it, if grief and isolation and the weight of my grandfather's strange journal had conjured phantom sounds from ordinary night noises. Then the scratching resumed at the window to the left of the door, that same deliberate vertical motion, and I understood with a clarity that turned my mouth dry that whatever was out there was moving clockwise around the cabin, testing each opening, each potential entry point, learning the structure with the systematic thoroughness of something that planned and calculated and thought. I stood slowly, moving toward the window despite every instinct screaming at me to hide, to retreat, to make myself small and invisible. But another part of me, some deeper inheritance that perhaps came from my grandfather and his grandfather before him, needed to see, needed to confirm what the rational part of my mind still wanted to deny. I kept to the side of the window, careful not to silhouette myself against the firelight, and peered out into the darkness. At first I saw nothing but my own faint reflection in the glass, and the tangle of forest beyond, trees rendered into abstract shapes by the night. Then the scratching stopped again and I caught movement, something massive shifting position just beyond the reach of the light spilling from the windows, something that stood tall enough that it couldn't possibly be a wolf or bear or any animal that belonged in these woods according to the natural order I had been taught to trust. The scratching continued its circuit, the side window, then the back door, then the kitchen window, then the bedroom window on the far side of the cabin. Each time it paused at a new location, I could hear it testing the frame, applying pressure as if assessing the strength of the barrier, the integrity of what separated us. The sounds were patient, almost contemplative, lacking the frenzy of a predator trying to reach prey or the panic of an animal seeking shelter from a storm. This was something else entirely, an investigation conducted with unsettling intelligence, and I found myself thinking about my grandfather's journal entry, about the creature knowing what he was thinking, about a relationship maintained over decades through mutual observation an unspoken understanding. When the scratching reached the bedroom window, I moved down the short hallway and pressed myself against the wall beside it, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, behind my eyes, in my fingertips where they touched the rough log walls. The sound was clearer here, and I could distinguish multiple points of contact, not a paw or single claw, but what sounded like individual fingers, each one dragging against the wood in turn, creating a rhythm that was almost musical in its precision. I thought about my grandfather, standing in this exact spot, listening to these same sounds, year after year, and wondered how he had ever grown accustomed to it, how he had transformed this terror into something approaching relationship. When the circuit was complete, and the scratching returned to the front door, I understood that it had learned everything it needed to know about the cabin's vulnerabilities, about where I was inside, about how the structure was built and where its weaknesses lay. But instead of attempting entry, instead of exploiting the knowledge it had gathered, the scratching simply stopped. The silence that followed felt charged with expectation, with a kind of question hanging in the air between us, and I realized that the creature had been announcing itself, demonstrating its capabilities not as a threat, but as a kind of introduction, showing me what it could do while choosing not to do it. I stood in that quiet for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to the fire settle and the wind move through the pines, and the old cabin creak around me, and felt something shift inside my understanding of fear and safety, and the borders we draw between civilization and wilderness. My grandfather had lived with this presence for decades, had maintained some kind of peace with it, and his journal suggested that peace was built on respect and ritual and acknowledgement, rather than barriers and weapons and denial. Whatever was outside had completed its inspection and withdrawn, but I knew with absolute certainty that it hadn't gone far, that it was watching still from somewhere in the darkness, waiting to see what kind of person I would prove to be, whether I carried my grandfather's understanding in my blood or whether I was just another outsider who happened to share his name. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't even pretend to try, so when the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the windows, I moved to the front door, with a mixture of relief and dread, grateful for the sun's return but terrified of what evidence the darkness might have left behind. My hand trembled on the deadbolt, that small steel mechanism suddenly seeming laughably inadequate, a child's pretend protection against something that had chosen restraint, rather than been prevented by my locks. I opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking in the early morning stillness, and the cold air that rushed in carried the scent of pine and damp earth and something else, something wild and musky, that reminded me of the wolf enclosure I'd visited once at a wildlife sanctuary, but deeper somehow, more concentrated, mixed with something almost human. The porch boards were covered in mud, great smears of it tracked back and forth, and there in the center of each print was the unmistakable evidence that my grandfather's sketches hadn't been the ravings of isolation or age. These were canine tracks, yes, massive ones that dwarfed any wolf print I'd seen in nature guides, but they tapered into elongated digits that suggested fingers, an impossible fusion of species that shouldn't exist according to every scientific principle I'd been taught to trust. I stepped out onto the porch in my bare feet, the cold wood shocking against my skin, and followed the trail of prints with my eyes, seeing how they approached from the forest in a four-legged gait that gradually shifted to two legs as they reached the cabin steps, the transformation documented in mud like some perverse evolutionary diagram compressed into 30 feet. The prints circled the cabin in that same clockwise pattern the scratching had followed, but here on the porch they lingered, clustered near the front window where the tracks showed it had stood in one place for an extended period, weight shifting from foot to foot in a patient stance. I moved to that spot and turned to face outward as it must have faced inward, trying to understand its perspective, what it had seen when it looked through that glass. From this angle I could see directly into the living room, could see the chair where I'd sat frozen with my grandfather's papers in my lap, and beyond that to the hallway leading to the bedroom, and I understood with a sick vertigo that it had been watching me the entire time. I thought I was alone, observing my reactions to its scratching circuit, measuring my fear or courage or whatever quality it was testing for. The prints then moved along the porch to the bedroom window, and there the mud was disturbed differently, smeared as if it had crouched or bent closer to the glass, and I forced myself to walk to that window and look inside. My bedroom was exactly as I'd left it, the bed still made because I'd never gotten into it, My open suitcase on the floor with clothes spilling out in the chaos of hasty unpacking. But seeing it from this outside perspective, imagining those amber eyes studying the intimate details of my temporary life here, felt like a violation and something else I couldn't quite name, a kind of initiation, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that privacy was an illusion in this place, that the boundaries between inside and outside, between human and wild, between observer and observed were far more permeable than I'd ever imagined. I pressed my palm against the window glass where its face must have been, felt the cold surface that had separated us by inches, and wondered what it had thought seeing me sleep or pace, or sit in my grandfather's chair reading his warnings. The prince led down from the porch and back into the forest, returning to 2 legs briefly before dropping to 4 as they disappeared into the undergrowth. And I understood that this transition between forms wasn't transformation but choice, that it moved as a wolf when it wanted speed or stealth, but stood as a man when it wanted to see clearly, to reach high, to communicate something that required a human posture and perspective. I stood on that porch as the sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened, still in my bare feet with my grandfather's journal clutched against my chest like a talisman, and felt the weight of being watched even now in full daylight. Felt its attention from somewhere in those trees as surely as I'd felt the scratching through the walls, but the fear had shifted into something more complex, textured with curiosity and recognition, because whatever this creature was, it had shown remarkable restraint, had announced itself rather than surprised me, had observed rather than attacked, had left me this evidence of its presence like a calling card or message written in mud and impossible anatomy. My grandfather had called it the Watcher. And I understood now that the name was reciprocal, that watching flowed both directions, that the pact he'd maintained had been built on mutual observation, and the respect that comes from truly seeing another being without flinching away from what challenges our comfortable categories. Something had shifted between us during that long night, some invisible negotiation had begun, and as I finally turned to go back inside I felt the strange certainty that we were learning each other. That this was only the beginning of a dialogue conducted in scratches and prints, and the vast, eloquent silence of recognition passing between species that should be enemies but might, if I proved worthy of my grandfather's legacy, become something else entirely. I spent that entire day reading my grandfather's journal from beginning to end, forcing myself through the archaic dialect of our language that my mother had spoken sparingly and my grandfather had tried to teach me during childhood summers I'd been too eager for modernity to appreciate. The early entries were mundane, logging weather patterns and animal migrations, tracking the health of the forest with the careful attention of someone whose survival depended on understanding the land's rhythms. But around the year 1973, the tone shifted abruptly, the handwriting becoming urgent and compressed, filling margins with symbols I recognized from the beadwork patterns my grandmother had sewn onto ceremonial clothing I'd seen only in photographs. He described finding tracks near the northern ridge, impossibly large canine prints that walked upright, and his decision to follow them against every instinct of self-preservation, driven by a need to understand what shared these woods with him. The entry for August 15th of that year was written into different inks, the first half in steady script, describing how he'd left a deer haunch at the forest edge as an offering. The second half added later in shaking letters that simply repeated it came. It understood over and over. Down the page, from that point forward, the journal became a record of devotion, a meticulous documentation of offerings left at every full moon, dried fish in winter, fresh berries in summer, tobacco wrapped in red cloth, venison from his November hunts, and brief notes about signs that the offerings had been accepted, the food taken, the tobacco scattered in patterns that seemed intentional rather than wine scattered. What struck me most wasn't the offerings themselves, but the language my grandfather used to describe the relationship, words that suggested covenant rather than appeasement, partnership rather than protection, money paid to a predator. He wrote about the forest's health, improving after the pact began, how the deer population stabilized, how invasive species seemed to retreat from certain areas, how the land itself felt more balanced in ways he struggled to articulate beyond saying the Watcher keeps what shouldn't be here away, maintains the boundary between worlds that humans have forgotten existed. I found sketches scattered throughout the later years showing the creature in various poses, standing sentinel on ridgelines, moving through deep snow with impossible grace, once sitting in an almost human posture beneath the old white pine that marked the northern boundary of our family's land, its wolf head tilted upward as if reading the stars. In these drawings, my grandfather had captured something beyond anatomy, had somehow conveyed intelligence and melancholy, an ancient purpose in the set of shoulders that were too broad for any wolf, in eyes that held emotions no animal should possess. The most recent entries were dated just days before his death, and the writing had deteriorated with his health, words trailing off mid-sentence, but the message was clear and desperate. Must tell them, must make them understand. The pact cannot break. The Watcher cannot be left alone. Our family promised, we promised. Who will remember when I'm gone? Who will keep the covenant? The final page contained a crude map marking a spot deep in the forest, with an X and a single word in our language that meant something between sacred and dangerous and necessary, a concept English had no equivalent for. I understood then with terrible clarity that my grandfather's death 3 weeks ago hadn't just been the loss of a man, but the breaking of a ritual maintained for nearly 5 decades, a sudden silence in a conversation that had been conducted faithfully across the boundary between human and something other. The Watcher had been left without its human counterpart, without the offerings that marked respect and recognition, without the acknowledgement that its presence and purpose were understood and honored. My grandfather's isolation in these woods hadn't been the retreat of a lonely old man, but the deliberate maintenance of a responsibility he couldn't explain to his assimilated children, who'd moved to cities and married outside the tribe and raised grandchildren like me who spoke English better than their own ancestral language. I felt anger rise in my throat, hot and acidic. Anger at my mother for never telling me, at my grandfather for keeping secrets even as his health failed, at myself for being so disconnected from my heritage that I'd needed muddy prints and midnight scratching to begin understanding what should have been passed down as birthright. But beneath the anger was something else, a strange stirring that might have been recognition or calling or the genetic memory of ancestors who'd known how to live in balance with beings that existed in the spaces between categories, who'd understood that the world was far more populated and complex than modern education. Acknowledged, I returned to the porch with the journal open to the map page, studying the landmark trees my grandfather had drawn to guide the way to whatever lay at that X in the forest's heart. The sun had already surrendered to dusk when I decided to make dinner, needing the mundane ritual of chopping vegetables and heating oil to anchor myself against the surreal weight of what I'd read. I moved through the kitchen mechanically, my grandfather's journal still open on the table behind me, its pages covered with sketches of the creature he'd called the Watcher. The cast iron skillet hissed as I added sliced potatoes, and I focused on that sound, that simple chemistry of heat and food, trying to convince myself that I could still live in a world of ordinary explanations. But my hands were shaking badly enough that I had to set down the knife, and I braced myself against the counter, staring at the window above the sink where darkness had transformed the glass into a mirror, reflecting the warm cabin interior. That's when I saw it behind my own reflection, standing perhaps 20 feet beyond the window in the space between the porch light's reach and the forest's absolute darkness, a figure so impossibly tall that its head rose above the window frame's top edge. My body understood before my mind could catch up, flooding my legs with adrenaline that somehow kept me frozen rather than sending me running, every muscle locked in a paralysis that might have been instinct. Recognizing that flight was pointless, in the window's reflection I watched it standing utterly motionless, its posture unsettlingly erect and human in configuration, broad shoulders squared and arms hanging at its sides in a way no wolf or bear or any natural predator would stand. But the head was pure animal, a massive wolf skull covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the dim light reaching it from the cabin, except for the eyes that reflected back in shades of amber and gold like flames behind glass. I couldn't turn around, couldn't break the strange displaced confrontation happening in reflection rather than direct sight, as if the window glass provided some crucial barrier or translation between worlds that shouldn't directly face each other. The thing didn't move, didn't display any of the restless shifting of weight that living creatures unconsciously perform, and that absolute stillness was more terrifying than aggression would have been because it suggested total control, perfect patience, intelligence that could override every animal impulse toward motion. Time stretched into something meaningless as we stood there, me frozen at my kitchen sink and it motionless in the darkness, connected only through reflection and glass and the terrible understanding that it had chosen this moment deliberately, had waited until I was occupied and vulnerable to reveal itself. I could see my own face in the window, pale and wide-eyed, hovering ghost-like over the scene behind me, where the creature's massive form stood sentinel, and the composition looked like something from my grandfather's sketches, the human and the other existing in the same frame, but separated by the fundamental boundary between categories of being. Its eyes never blinked, never wavered from where I stood, and I realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that it was studying me, just as intensely as I was trying to comprehend it, that this wasn't a predator evaluating prey but something far more complex and intentional. The amber eyes seemed to hold questions or perhaps accusations, a weight of expectation that pressed against my chest and made breathing difficult, and I understood that it knew exactly who I was, that it had been watching and waiting since my arrival, recognizing my grandfather's bloodline, and waiting to see what I would do with the inheritance I hadn't known existed. The spell broke when the oil in the forgotten skillet began smoking, the acrid smell pulling my attention away for just a second, as I reached automatically to move the pan off the burner. When I looked back to the window, the reflection showed only darkness and the ghostly outline of pine trees swaying in wind I couldn't hear through the glass. The space where it had stood was empty. No sign it had ever been there except for my hammering heart and the sweat cooling on my skin, and the absolute certainty that something fundamental had shifted, that I had been seen and evaluated, and that whatever came next would depend entirely on choices I still didn't fully understand how to make. I couldn't leave the windows. After that, couldn't retreat to the false security of interior rooms where I wouldn't see it coming. So I moved through the cabin with my back to the walls and my eyes trained on every pane of glass that opened onto the night. It was there at the living room window when I entered, the same towering silhouette rendered in shades of darkness against darkness, visible only because of its absolute stillness while everything else in the forest moved with wind. When I crossed to the bedroom, it followed along the exterior wall, keeping pace with my movement inside, and I could track its progress by the subtle shifts of shadow passing each window in sequence like a terrible countdown. This wasn't the behavior of any animal I'd ever encountered, no predator stalking prey or territorial challenge being issued, but something that felt ritualistic and intentional, as if it was performing a specific pattern that held meaning I was supposed to understand. The intelligence behind those movements was undeniable and profoundly disturbing, each repositioning calculated and purposeful, demonstrating that it knew the cabin's layout perfectly and was orchestrating this dance between us with complete control. I realized it could have broken through these windows at any point, could have shattered glass and would to reach me, but it remained outside those barriers as if bound by rules or agreements that predated my arrival and constrained its actions in ways that had nothing to do with physical capability. The night stretched into a sleepless vigil where I became the watched rather than the watcher. My role reversed into something passive and exposing that stripped away every illusion of human dominance I'd carried unconsciously. My entire life, every time I approached a window, there it was, repositioned and waiting, and the consistency of its presence became almost hypnotic, my initial terror gradually transforming into something more complex that included fascination and a bizarre sense of connection. Its eyes tracked my every movement with an attention that felt personal rather than predatory, and I began to recognize something in its posture that might have been expectation, or even frustration, as if it was waiting for me to do or say or understand something that remained maddeningly just beyond my comprehension. I thought of my grandfather performing his rituals at the forest edge, leaving offerings and maintaining boundaries through actions that must have looked insane to anyone who didn't know what watched from the trees, and I wondered how many nights he'd spent like this in his early years, learning the language of this impossible relationship. The creature shifted position again, moving from the bedroom window to the bathroom, then to the small window in the hallway, and I followed its progression like a partner in some ancient dance, our movements synchronized and responsive, two beings circling each other through walls and glass in a pattern that felt older than memory. When dawn finally began graying the eastern sky, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my grandfather's journal open before me, and I looked up to find the creature still there at the window, fully visible now in the growing light. In daylight it was even more impossible, standing easily 7 feet tall with proportions that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares, its body covered in dark fur that shifted between black and deep brown depending on how the light caught it. The wolf's head was massive and perfectly formed, not some diseased or mutated thing but deliberately itself, as if evolution or magic or something beyond both had crafted it with intention. but it was the eyes that held me, amber and gold and utterly aware, containing a depth of consciousness that made my throat tight with emotions I couldn't name, something between recognition and grief and a terrible understanding that my life had just divided into before and after this moment. It didn't react to the sunrise, didn't retreat to darkness like the monster my rational mind insisted it must be, but held its position as the light strengthened, allowing me to see it fully, offering itself to my comprehension in a gesture that felt like communication or perhaps a challenge. Then slowly, with movements so deliberate they could only be intentional, it turned its massive head to the left, directing my attention toward the forest, then back to me, then to the forest again with unmistakable purpose. It repeated this gesture 3 times, the meaning crystallizing with each repetition, and I understood with sudden clarity that it wasn't threatening me or hunting me, but trying to show me something, leading me somewhere, waiting with inhuman patience for me to accept an invitation I didn't know how to refuse. When it turned and walked toward the tree line, with that same unsettling upright gait, it paused at the forest edge and looked back, and the weight of that gaze carried an unmistakable message: follow, understand, choose. I waited until full daylight before descending into my grandfather's cellar, a space I'd avoided during my first days in the cabin because it belonged completely to him, still thick with the smell of tobacco and old wood and the particular stillness that gathers in places where someone spent countless solitary hours. The stairs creaked under my weight with sounds that memory recognized, and I carried his journal like a talisman against the darkness that the single bulb couldn't quite dispel from the corners. The creature had vanished into the forest with the sunrise, but its invitation hung in the air, like a physical presence, and I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't follow, couldn't step beyond the cabin's boundaries into whatever waited among those trees, until I understood the full scope of what my grandfather had bound me to through blood and silence. The cellar was exactly as he'd left it, tools arranged with military precision on pegboards, shelves lined with preserves and supplies, and against the far wall a heavy wooden chest I'd never seen before, its surface carved with symbols that made my eyes slide away when I tried to focus on them directly, as if the patterns themselves resisted comprehension. The chest was locked, but the key hung on a nail driven into the wall above it, placed with such obvious intention that I understood he'd meant for it to be found, had staged this discovery knowing that someday I would stand exactly where I stood now, facing exactly the choice that paralyzed me. Inside, wrapped in cloth that crumbled at my touch, I found bundles of dried sage and cedar, animal bones carved with more of those sliding symbols, a collar made of leather and fur that looked centuries old, and beneath everything a letter in my grandfather's handwriting with my name written across the envelope in ink that had faded to brown. My hands shook as I opened it, and his voice rose from the page so clearly I could hear his accent, his careful formation of English words shaped by a native tongue he'd tried to teach me in childhood before my parents' ambitions pulled us away to cities where such knowledge seemed irrelevant and embarrassing. The letter began, without preamble or comfort: if you're reading this, then it has shown itself to you, and the choice I hoped you'd never face is now yours to make, and I'm sorry for that burden more than you can know, until you've carried it as I have for 53 years. He explained that our family had been bound to the creature for 7 generations, ever since our ancestor had witnessed the slaughter of its mate and children by French trappers and had hidden the last surviving cub, in defiance of the men who employed him, nursing it back to health and returning it to the deep forest, where its kind had lived since time before memory. The creature I'd seen at my window wasn't that cub, but its descendant, one of the last of its kind, and the pact between our families had been forged in that original act of mercy, and maintained through generations of offering and protection and absolute secrecy. My grandfather wrote of the responsibility, with a weight that pressed through the paper, describing how the creature's territory had slowly diminished as development encroached, how it relied on our family to monitor the boundaries and warn away those who came too close to the sacred places it guarded, sites where its ancestors had performed rituals that kept balances I couldn't begin to understand. He detailed the offerings he'd made at each full moon, the signs he'd learned to read that indicated danger or need, the times he'd had to intervene to protect it from hunters or researchers who'd caught rumors of something impossible moving through these woods. But the cost of this protection had been crushing isolation, relationships sacrificed, and a normal life abandoned because he could never explain where he went during those long nights, could never share the truth that would have sounded like madness or worse, and he confessed that he'd driven my father away deliberately, hoping to break the chain and free future generations from this inheritance. But blood calls to blood, he wrote in a passage that made my vision blur. And the choice isn't really mine to make or unmake, because the creature chooses to, and it has chosen you as it chose me. Recognized something in you that makes you worthy of trust, or perhaps just desperate enough, in its dwindling solitude, to hope you might understand what others cannot. The final paragraph of his letter transformed everything I thought I'd understood about the past 3 days, revealing that the creature wasn't just a guardian of place but a keeper of memory, one of the last living connections to a world that existed before maps and borders, and the certainty that humanity owned every inch of earth we touched. My grandfather wrote that its kind had witnessed the arrival of the first humans to these lands, had made pacts with them when both species were young, and the boundaries between animal and person and spirit remained fluid and negotiable, and those ancient agreements still held weight in places where the old ways weren't completely forgotten. The creature had protected our family as surely as we'd protected it, standing in visible watch over our bloodline for generations, and my grandfather's death had left it vulnerable and exposed in ways that went beyond physical threat to something he called the unraveling of covenant. He ended with words that felt like both blessing and curse. It won't harm you, but it needs you, and that need will reshape your life as it reshaped mine, and you must decide if the world can afford to lose what it represents, or if some responsibilities transcend the individual comfort we're taught to prioritize above all else. I sat on the cellar floor with that letter in my hands as morning light slanted through the high windows, and I understood with devastating clarity that my grandfather hadn't just left me property, but a choice that would define everything I became from this moment forward. The storm arrived that evening with a violence that felt intentional, wind hammering the cabin with fists of rain, while thunder rolled through the forest like artillery fire. And I sat at my grandfather's table with his journal and letters spread before me like cards in a fortune-telling I'd never asked for but couldn't refuse. I'd spent the day preparing without quite admitting what I was preparing for, gathering the herbs from the cellar and reading his detailed notes about their uses, learning the prayers he'd written phonetically in our language because he'd known I'd forgotten, the pronunciation my tongue had shaped in childhood. The conviction had settled into my bones during those hours of study that I wouldn't leave, couldn't walk away from this inheritance no matter how it terrified me, or how completely it would alter the trajectory I'd planned for my life, because some responsibilities did transcend individual comfort, and the creature's patient presence at my windows had awakened something in me that recognized kinship with its terrible solitude. When the scratching came at the door, it sounded different from before, urgent and irregular rather than methodical, and when I opened it with my heart climbing into my throat, I found the Dogman collapsed on my porch, rain streaming from its fur and it wound across its shoulder, leaking darkness that looked black in the storm light. Its amber eyes met mine with an expression that shattered every assumption about the distance between human and animal consciousness, and I saw in that gaze pain and vulnerability and a question that hung between us more clearly than words could have articulated. I should have been paralyzed with fear, but my grandfather's blood moved through my veins with knowledge deeper than reason, and I found myself stepping aside in wordless invitation, watching as the creature pulled itself across the threshold and into the cabin that had probably never held its kind before despite generations of pact and offering. It was massive in the enclosed space, forced to hunch beneath ceiling beams, its presence transforming the familiar room into something from a folktale, where the boundaries between worlds grew thin and negotiable. I moved on instinct, guided by grandfather's notes, heating water and gathering the herbs he'd described for wound treatment, crushing sage and cedar with hands that remembered this motion from dreams I'd thought were only imagination. The creature watched me with that unsettling intelligence as I approached, making no sound when I cleaned the wound, with movements my conscious mind didn't fully understand, but my body performed with inherited certainty, and I could see the injury had been made by something metallic, a trap perhaps, or a bullet that had grazed rather than killed. As I worked, I found myself speaking in the fragments of our language that remained in my memory, words my grandfather had taught me for grandmother and forest and sacred, and the creature's breathing steadied as if those sounds carried meaning beyond vocabulary, represented something essential that it had feared was lost forever with the old man's death. The wound wasn't as severe as the blood had suggested, and as I bound it with strips of cloth, the creature shifted to watch the storm through the window, and I understood that the injury itself wasn't why it had come to my door in vulnerability, but to test whether the pact would hold, whether I would honor what my grandfather had maintained or choose the easier path of denial and abandonment. I sat back against the wall with exhaustion and adrenaline draining away, leaving only a strange peace that felt like coming home after years of wandering in countries whose languages I'd never quite mastered. And I spoke aloud the decision that had probably been made the moment I'd chosen to drive north to this isolated place. "I'll stay," I said in English and then again in the halting syllables of our language that felt clumsy on my tongue but right in my chest. And the creature turned its massive head toward me with an expression that might have been relief or gratitude or simply acknowledgement that the burden my grandfather had carried had found new shoulders willing to bear its weight. The terror I'd felt during our first encounters had transformed into something more complex, a recognition that I'd been given responsibility for protecting something the world desperately needed even as it pushed relentlessly toward its extinction, and that this creature with its impossible existence represented a truth more important than my comfort or my plans or the life I'd thought I wanted before claw marks on a doorframe had opened passages I'd forgotten existed. We remained there through the storm's duration in a communion that required no language, human and Dogman sharing space in a cabin that had witnessed this covenant for generations, and I felt my grandfather's presence in the room, as surely as if he sat in his chair watching his legacy take root in soil he'd prepared through decades of sacrifice. When dawn finally gentled the sky and the creature rose to leave, moving with care for its bound shoulder, it paused at the threshold and touched its massive paw to my hand in a gesture that felt ceremonial and binding. And I understood that I'd crossed an invisible boundary from which there would be no return, had accepted guardianship of something ancient and necessary that the modern world had no category to contain. After it vanished into the forest, I stood on the porch breathing air that tasted different, seeing the trees with eyes that recognized them as more than landscape, but as territory I would learn and protect and eventually love with the fierce devotion my grandfather had carried silently until his death. The isolation he'd warned about didn't frighten me as it should have, because I'd been isolated my entire life, in cities full of people, had been searching without knowing it for exactly this sense of purpose that aligned with something deeper than ambition or success as the world measured such things. And as I walked back inside to begin studying his journals in earnest, I felt the weight of inheritance settle across my shoulders like a mantle I'd been shaped since birth to wear. The weeks that followed my acceptance of the pact transformed me in ways I couldn't have articulated to anyone from my former life, which receded with surprising speed into something that felt like a story I'd once heard about someone else who'd lived in apartments with thin walls and commuted through traffic, and measured worth in promotions and salary increases. I learned the forest with an attention that bordered on reverence, walking its boundaries at dawn and dusk, beginning to understand what my grandfather had been protecting and why the Dogman's presence was essential to maintaining something the world had forgotten to value. There were places in those woods where the air felt different, where reality seemed constructed of thinner material, and I came to recognize these as sites the creature patrolled with particular vigilance, locations where something older than human memory pressed against the present moment seeking acknowledgement. The Dogman appeared regularly now without the menace that had characterized our early encounters, materializing from the trees to walk parallel to my path. And gradually I stopped flinching at its presence, began to feel an odd comfort in knowing I wasn't alone in this vast green cathedral that had become my responsibility and my home. I continued the offerings my grandfather had maintained, leaving meat and herbs at the forest edge while speaking the prayers I was slowly relearning, and understood finally that these weren't payments or appeasement, but gestures of relationship, acknowledgement that we shared stewardship of something neither of us owned, but both served. My grandfather's journal became my Bible and map, its pages revealing not just information about the creature, but about our family's long history as keepers of thresholds, a role that stretched back further than written records to times when the boundary between human and animal, physical and spiritual, was understood as permeable and requiring constant tending. I learned that the Dogman was one of several guardians in these forests, remnants of an older world that persisted in places humans had forgotten to destroy, and that my family's pact ensured these beings could continue their work unmolested, protected from the hunting parties and researchers who occasionally ventured too close to mysteries they had no framework to comprehend. The responsibility was larger than I'd initially understood, extending beyond simple offerings to active protection, which meant I would spend my life here in isolation, watching for threats and maintaining the careful balance my grandfather had devoted decades to preserving. Some nights the weight of it pressed against my chest with suffocating force, and I'd stand on the porch gulping air, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake in accepting a burden that would consume whatever other life I might have built. But then I'd see the Dogman silhouette between the trees or hear its low call echoing through the darkness, and I'd remember that some purposes were worth the sacrifice they demanded. That meaning wasn't found in comfort but in alignment with something that transcended individual desire. The creature's wound healed cleanly over those weeks, and I took absurd pride in that successful tending, as if it represented proof of my worthiness for this role I'd inherited. And one evening it brought me something I hadn't expected, a gesture of reciprocity that redefined our relationship beyond duty into something approaching partnership. I found a deer on my porch at dawn, freshly killed and still warm, left there during the night by paws that had learned to move silently enough not to wake me. And I understood this was provision. The creature ensuring I could survive in this isolation it required me to maintain. The gift moved me to tears I didn't fully understand. Gratitude mixed with recognition that I was being cared for even as I provided care. That the terrible loneliness my grandfather had warned about was different from the isolation I'd felt my entire life, because it was loneliness with purpose. Solitude in service of something that mattered with an intensity that made my previous concerns seem trivial by comparison. I processed the deer using skills I'd learned from YouTube videos on my laptop while I still had internet access, and later when I'd let the service lapse. Because I no longer needed connection to a world that felt increasingly irrelevant, I'd rely on knowledge gleaned from grandfather's journals and from observation, and from the creature itself, which sometimes watched me work with what looked like approval in its amber eyes. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came the full realization of what I'd chosen: snow isolating the cabin for weeks at a time. My days measured by the rituals of survival and stewardship that left no room for doubt or second guessing. Because the work was too immediate and necessary, the Dogman appeared more frequently during the brutal cold, its massive form somehow comforting rather than frightening now, and I'd see it patrolling the boundaries even in blizzards that kept me confined indoors, its dedication shaming my occasional moments of weakness, when I'd fantasize about abandoning this responsibility for heated apartments and human conversation. But those moments passed quickly, because I'd waken the night to find it standing guard outside my window and know that I'd found something most people spent entire lives searching for, without success, a purpose that aligned perfectly with capacities I'd never known I possessed, a belonging that had nothing to do with fitting into spaces others had constructed and everything to do with becoming who I'd always been beneath the expectations and assumptions I'd mistaken for identity. My grandfather's ghost felt present in those winter months, his satisfaction palpable in the cabin's warm spaces, and I'd sometimes speak to him aloud, reporting on the forest's condition and the creature's wellness. Continuing conversations death had interrupted, but not ended, and I understood finally that this inheritance was a gift rather than a burden, that he'd given me not isolation but purpose, not loneliness but connection to something most of the world had lost access to. And I was grateful beyond language for the claw marks on a door frame that had called me home to a life I'd been wandering toward my entire existence without knowing what I sought. What burden would you accept to protect something the world has forgotten? Subscribe to hear more stories from the places where legend and reality merge.